welcome. Happy to have you in St. Louis, Lynn and Dyjuan in particular, and Mary, my colleague and my friend for how many years. Welcome to this time that we have together. I still have emotional, visceral response to what we just saw, as I'm sure that those in the audience do as well. And so I'm centering in that. In particular, I'd like to ask an opening question. See who wants to respond first. I want to have you in mind, but let's see how this goes. The first question is, can you speak about what it means for our society when so much of our intellectual potential is behind prison walls? What do you see as the action plan of what we need to do about what you've been seeing and experiencing?
So I think, just to be blunt, the amount of potential that we lock away in prison in this country just points to the huge amount of waste in resources that we are comfortable with, right? And this relates to how many people we have in prison in this country and how inefficient that system is, right? We have over 2 million people in prison. 600,000 of them return to society every year. Within 3 years, 66% of them will be back in prison, right? We would not accept those type of numbers from any other system, right? Imagine Ford or GM recalling 66% of their cars every 3 years. They would be out of business overnight. So when we look at these type of systemic inequities that impact Black and brown communities, that tells us that this is a country and we have a system that is okay with writing off not just potential, but particular types of potential.
So why was it important to you to be in this film?
Why was it important to me to be in this film is that, when Lynn and Sarah showed up at Eastern, we didn't know what to expect. And I went to debate practice that week, expecting to prepare for a debate, and we actually debated the merits of being in this film, right? And it came down to two things. One is that we looked at their work on public television over the past 20, 30, 40 years with Ken Burns, and decided these are people and this was a space that we could trust with our stories. But more importantly, most of what you see about people in prison is stigmatizing, it is degrading, and we wanted them to tell a different story about who incarcerated people are in this country and what we're capable of.
Thank you for sharing that. Lynn, I'm really interested in a whole lot of things to ask you. So what I want to start off with is, my understanding is this is a debut film for you as lead. And out of all the ways that you could have debuted, this is the content that you selected, or did it call you? And, what was the rationale behind that?
Yeah, it absolutely did call me and Sarah. And I'll say that I've worked with Ken Burns since 1989. Very thrilled to have the chance to learn from him, collaborate with him, and partner with him on many, many projects. But I always sort of wondered, well, I would like to make a film on my own one day. What would it be like and what would it be? And I didn't want it to be a similar kind of project. I was looking for something different. But I wasn't really actively looking for anything, to tell the truth. We just had the experience of being exposed to the program. I taught in the program myself after one visit to one class, where Sarah and I were so blown away that we just realized this would be an incredible story. And by teaching in the program myself, I got a deeper understanding of the rigor, the approach of the students, the interaction with the faculty, and just a more on-the-ground feeling of what it really was like. But I was still, as a professor, and I put quotes around, you're kind of at a remove from the students. You're really interacting with them as a professor and not really on an interpersonal level that much. So anyway, I felt, and Sarah felt too, that we were so surprised and sort of blown away by the level of academic accomplishment that we could sense and where it was happening. And the juxtaposition of those two things just raised so many questions, and we wanted to find the answers. And we really thought that the world needed to see that this was happening, and that it would ultimately do what we hoped it would do, what Dyjuan said.
Mm-hmm.
to reimagine so many things that so many of us in society have assumptions about, things we don't know.
For anyone to respond to this, but so in St. Louis context, we have enjoyed celebrating the impact of programs, almost to the extent, in many instances, not all, that the program equals the solution.
The box is checked. You just done. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so not to diminish the power of BPI in doing that, but I would love to hear more from you of not just the studying and books and papers, but what was it about BPI's approach, its mindset, that you can share, that as we think in St. Louis, as we think in Missouri, what needs to be in place in terms of kind of that special sauce in the ecosystem?
So I think, whenever we're thinking about programs, and we often think about these things as inputs, that they're there to service people, and people go into them, and we're like, oh, that's there, that's happening, we can walk away, right?
Yeah.
That's going to work. And sometimes that's not the case. We need to think about the outputs of those programs. And, at BPI, we have students do 20, 30 years in prison and walk out and get into comparative literature programs at Cornell and get PhDs from Yale and master's degrees from Columbia and go on to do all types of different things. And that's because at BPI, we have a serious allergy to what we call the culture of low expectations. When Max Kenner founded this program, people wanted him to be everything but a college, right? They wanted him to reward credits and certificates, but not degrees. And he resisted that. All of our students at BPI are in degree-granting program. They are students at Bard College. They receive Bard College degrees, and we are unique in this space for doing that. I walked out of prison and went to Bard College and finished my degree. So, Leon Bodstein, who's the president of Bard College and likes to call out some of our most liberal institutions, he believes that, you really have to put your money where your mouth is, right? And it's not enough just to say, oh, we're in prison and we're giving them an education, right? It's also how you engage with people long term. People think of the culmination of what we do as degree granting. For us, is what our students get out and go and do with those degrees. And so we also do reentry because we found out that we needed it, right? And so for us, it's not just about the program, it's about how that program helps individuals become empowered, to have control of their own success in the world.
Thoughts on that, Lynn? Or?
Yeah, well, I would just add that when I had the opportunity to teach in the program myself, and I met with Max Kenner, the director of the program, who you saw, and he said, we'd love a film course. We don't have any film classes. You could do a documentary and history and sort of, break down what you do, but you can only do it if you promise me that this is going to be a very rigorous academic course. We can't just go have the students come and watch a movie and talk about it in class. There have to be serious readings, serious writing, serious assessment, and if they don't do that, you have to give them an F. Okay? So, and that was just, that's the basic. They don't want anyone to come in there and think, oh, I'm just, benevolently kind of bestowing my noblesse oblige on people. They want it to be a rigorous academic interchange, and you saw that in the film. And I think that's sort of the DNA of the program.
Mary, what do you envision as the common ground? You were the great student. You watched everything to the last detail, and I'm interested to know, what do you see that links the struggle, the challenge, and the beauty of St. Louis and our path of building toward racial equity? What are you thinking right now?
Well, one of the things that struck me about hearing the students' reaction to their education was not only what you were getting out of it personally, but how it changed your view of the country, how it changed your view of history and society. So the idea that we want to see a different future, and giving a rigorous serious, deep educational opportunity to people, no matter their circumstances, allows that possibility for having those kinds of critical thinking skills to look at what you called earlier some juxtapositions, but the idea that we're supposed to have a system of incarceration that is about redemption and second chances and paying your debt, but not really. So we have these juxtapositions, and we have the same thing in our culture about the debates between the benefits of a pluralistic society and the downside of pluralism. So learning to have that critical eye to be able to apply to the system that we're in and question it and imagine something different. I think a lot of it was just igniting a student's imagination to want to have something different, to be someone different, to have a different future. And I saw that in so many of the stories, and the idea that it's empowering for yourself, but it's also empowering you to be a different kind. I think one of the students used the word a civic actor, the civic engagement, the understanding how our systems work, and then working to make them work for us.
I'd like to call this portion of our discussion naming the elephants in the room. It's kind of my style.
Go for it.
Green light, thank you. Much of the policy conversation around criminal justice reform and mass incarceration has been about people incarcerated for nonviolent drug-related convictions. We make exceptions, we separate out, we target on this group, etc. But many of the students in this film are in prison for violent crimes. Okay. Can you talk about how this film could contribute to helping shift the narrative, shift the conversation, help us to think about the nuance, and maybe offer a human-centered conversation on this issue? What are your reactions to that?
So, just in relation to the film, well, no, let me back up a little bit just to talk about how we think about crime and criminality in the American consciousness, right? Most people have a theoretical relationship to crime and criminality. The reality of the matter is that crime is never going to touch you. It's never going to affect you. It doesn't even happen in your community, right? We know where crime happens. It happens in communities of color and very, very concentrated districts of poverty, right? But the American media has convinced us all that we could get robbed at any time going down the street. That is not true. And the movement has been to reduce people, incarcerated people, as Rodney points out in the film, down to the crime they have committed. We talk about robbers, we talk about burglars instead of people that have committed crimes. And so those type of things structure our thinking in this space. And so one of the things that the film does, before it gets, if you see, once you watch the whole film, before Lynn and Sarah asked us what we were in prison for, they asked us what we were studying, right? They engaged us as people, as students, and we are introduced in the film as people. And people like yourselves, first, before learning what we're in prison for, right, before this reductive type thinking can happen, you acknowledge our humanity. So what the film does, and everyone featured in the film is in prison for a serious crime, right? It contextualizes and makes people acknowledge the circumstances of other people's lives that a lot of people live at a remove from. And that is very, very important towards changing the conversation around how we think about who incarcerated people are, and again, what they're capable of.
I will try without the water to answer, but I agree. Everything Dyjuan said was very consciously on our part to try to do that. And, we didn't set out to address this issue in the film per se. We set out to get to know the students and see what they're up to. And then over time, as we started to get to know them better, we realized this question that many people were. And in fact, we're not going to solve mass incarceration if we don't address the issue, and we've had the easy conversations about people who are innocent, and this is an unspeakable tragedy, and there's, that's an important conversation to have. And people who are convicted of nonviolent drug offenses, also an important conversation to have, but that's not the majority of people who are incarcerated. So we have, on one level, divided people up into categories and avoided discussing the hard questions, which is what do we as a society do to help both the communities that have suffered harm, and often the people who have committed the harm are coming from those same communities and have suffered harm themselves. And so all of that is contextualized in the film, and you begin to understand a much bigger picture. And you also see the role of education in helping people, give them, they would say, the kind of consciousness and tools to understand their world, themselves, their actions, and what to do, and give them also the capacity, they would say again, to do something with their lives, to make purpose, and what Giovanni said at the end. So we really didn't set out to make a film about this, but it's embedded in the film, and I think we've seen in conversations that it really is helping drive this much deeper conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on your thought, Dyjuan, about crime and criminality, and how it is also nuanced that crime and criminality, there is often an assignment of forgiveness or mercy for those that are not black and brown. Crime and criminality and the assignment of criminal and a permanency affixed to it often happens, as we see in the film, as we see in society, even here in the region, is assigned to black and brown people. It is what it is. Told you this was the elephant in the room portion. So continuing
Well,
with, yeah, go
and
ahead.
also not assigning criminality or violence to systems that perpetuate inequity in education or inequity in housing or inequity of all kinds of opportunities, but we ignore that or don't use those words to describe them. We say that's the way it is or that's the policy, but there is violence being done in the name of the society and the culture and the powers that be when schools don't prepare young people. Yeah.
Violence and trauma. Trauma happens at the individual level, and then we see toxic policy as trauma, and we see trauma in the systems level as well. How, Lynn, as a white person, did directing this film make you confront your own values, your own socialization? How did it speak to your convictions? What did it raise for you that made you a little uncomfortable? Tell us about the experience.
Thank you for asking that question. I will say first that Sarah and I first were invited to give a lecture in BPI in 2012 in the prison that you saw at Eastern, and that was my first time in a prison. So just to start, as a privileged person who I consider myself progressive, liberal, open-minded, I'd never been in a prison. I didn't know anyone who was incarcerated. No one in my extended family had ever had any serious problems with the criminal justice system. So I had no proximity whatsoever to this problem, and I am embarrassed / ashamed to say that I was intellectually very concerned, as I am about many issues in our society, including the legacy of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow, and I've made films that have dealt with really serious issues in our society, and yet I didn't put myself there physically. And so the experience of walking into prison the very first time, I found it shocking, even though I knew intellectually that this is what it was, that the vast majority of the people that I saw walk by were people of color. I hardly saw any white people except for the officers. And it felt like you're walking onto a plantation, or what I imagine a plantation would feel like. The affect of the people, the affect of the officers, the whole experience was deeply, deeply disturbing and searing, to be honest. So, it's a lot of things happen in your mind and your heart and your soul at that moment if you're me. And then we walked into the classroom and we saw this extraordinary brilliance on a level that I don't remember from my very fancy Ivy League education. What I remember from my education was a lot of people kind of like showing off in class and trying to impress the professor, and I don't know. Anyway, this was really different. It was very collaborative and sort of, it seemed like pure intellectual endeavor for its own sake. It was really quite incredible. So there's just a lot of juxtapositions happening on just one day. And then as we got into the project and really understood through the students' personal stories, their experiences. It just deepened my appreciation for what they do, who I am, where I come from. And, we tried very hard to have a very inclusive team working on the project. We had advisors who were formerly incarcerated, who were part of the program, and who were historians. Some of the graduates helped us try to center ourselves. So I really do hope this is not, this is certainly not my story. This is their story told by them in their voices, and we didn't do it without sort of workshopping it, or not even workshopping it, trying to make sense of this material in our own backgrounds, throughout the entire endeavor. And I could go on at greater length, but that's just the opening.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
What do you feel like, open to all three of you to think about, again, centering around the fact that here, the work of the Ferguson Commission, which came about because young people activated, young people stepped up, young people sparked movement and continued accountability, and accountability grew from there, right? When I think about the time of the commission and beyond, think about the events that reminded us, it wasn't a new thing, but sure reminded us in a new way, the work that we have yet to do, right, in this region and beyond that. We learned, and we continue to say in the commission's report, that policy and policy change and good policy and good implementation of policy is so essential. It may be new to some people and some viewers that programs like BPI have been around, but there are times in the policy realm that made this easier to implement and not so easy to implement. Can you share a bit more about the policy walk, the policy history, and what's happening now?
So I think first, just to begin, I just want to point out that, the prison population in this country is not a function of the crime rate. It is a function of policy. It is a function of how our elected officials respond to small spikes in crime. And small spikes in crime have caused huge spikes in incarceration. Over a span of 30 years in this country, we went from having 200,000 people in prison to having 2 million. That is insane. But when we talk about the policy around college and prison, if anyone doesn't know, we had college and prison in a very broad way across this country for over a generation. Malcolm X went to college and prison. The 1994 crime bill, Democrats' tough on crime moment, eviscerated college and prison. They ended Pell eligibility to people in prison, to a particular set of people for very, very pernicious reasons. Had nothing to do with the facts. We knew that if someone got an education in prison, they were the least likely to go back. But we felt that as a society, we needed to punish people. We went from having nationally about 800 programs to less than 10 overnight. And so the Barred Prison Initiative was created at Bard College by a group of undergraduates in the wake of that Pell ban, right? And these were young people who had gone into the prison as tutors in a different program and asked the students there, what do you need? And, and the incarcerated people said, we need education. And they went back to Bard College and went to Bard College's longtime president, Leon Botstein, and said, hey, this is what we want to do. And Bard figured out a way to do that, and here we are 20 years later with 350 students in 6 different New York State correctional facilities. And the work that we've done over the past 20 years, and what this film is doing, is to help change policy at the local, at the state, at the federal level. We have the REAL Act, is now moving through Congress. That is an act that will restore Pell eligibility to incarcerated people in prison. And people like to think of this as something new. This is not something new. This is not something innovative. This is something that has been tried and tested, and we know that it works, and we're not doing it.
I found that very interesting in the statistics about the program's success. So the clip with Governor Cuomo saying only 4% of the students who complete this program end up back in the system. I've worked in the nonprofit world for a long time. I've worked in education. If we can say something is that successful, we are throwing money behind it, saying we need to take this to scale. This is wonderful. We should do it everywhere. We should replicate. It should. And I found it the opposite in the reaction of people in the film. And also, I believe it was part of the clip on President Obama, but it was something else I read, that the cost of keeping a person in prison for a year is about $69,000, I believe I read.
It's on average. Every state is different, but right.
Right, and maybe those were the New York State numbers, and the cost of this program per student was $9,000.
Oh, this program has saved New York State. I mean, they don't like me to say this because that's not the argument for it, but when taxpayers complain, I mean, this is a privately funded program that has saved the taxpayers millions of dollars in lost, I mean, every dollar spent in education saves $5 when people don't go back, and re-engagement with the criminal justice system.
Right,
But
so
I
when
wanted to
people
just
say they
flag-
need evidence,
There is evidence.
is.
The evidence is there
The
already.
evidence is there.
But I wanted to just double back about the question of implementation, because I think that's really important. You can pass a bill, you can have a policy, you can agree you're going to do something, and then if you take your eye off the ball, it doesn't actually get implemented properly, and people think, like, that's why I said the box is checked, we did that. And I think one of the things that film shows so important is that when this does, I've heard Max Kenner say this, so I'm really quoting him, but when the REAL Act is passed and there is federal money available and we can put college back in every prison, we as citizens have to hold our political leaders, corrections department, education departments, colleges, universities accountable that they're doing what they say they're doing and not just taking the money and shortchanging the people.
And, you know, whenever we're speaking to policy questions like this, and especially in this space, we're having a coded conversation about race, right? There have been federal policies for centuries and centuries in this country that has marginalized African-American communities, right? It is no coincidence that we took Pell out of prison, you know, after we had incarcerated black and brown men to a ratio of like 4 to 1 in this country, comparative to Caucasians, right? And so that is no incident, right? We in this country has really found it hard to make deep investments in black and brown communities, especially in areas of education. It's one of the reasons that we totally underfund public colleges and universities. We have more prisons and jails in this country than we do public colleges and universities, right? And where do the majority of minorities find their education? In public colleges and universities. So whenever we're having these type of questions in relation to policy, we must remember that they are coded by race and that this is a country that has still yet to reckon totally with the history of slavery here.
Given those comments, Mary, what is your experience of what we're talking about at the St. Louis level? How have you seen this play out?
Well, I have worked in both K-12 public education and higher ed public and private universities. And it's exactly what Dyjuan said. It's a lack of investment. There's the hard money side, and then there is the expectation, the mindset that says, even if I put the money there, it's not a good investment. I mean, if we really want to name names, do things, I taught education courses, and I used to say education is grounded in two very damaging myths, a myth of white superiority or white supremacy and a myth of black intellectual inferiority. That's what our education systems operate within. That's what permeates the mindset of, I was in teacher education, you have to work with teachers, you have to work with administrators. The idea of a classroom where there is rigor and high expectation it's interesting that that is the whole premise of the BPI program, and comments were made by students. I wasn't taught like this. I never knew I was smart. I never heard these things before. I feel cheated. That goes all the way back to how if we set up our public school districts based on property tax to fund them, if we have housing segregation and economic disinvestment in communities, we get the schools we set up to have. And that sets certain students up for one path and other students, and it is coded by race. It's very clear. If you're in St. Louis, 5 minutes, someone will ask you the zip code question, which is the high school question, where you went to high school, because they want to know what community you lived in, because our communities are coded by race and class. And we know that. Our schools operate that way. We've had some experiments to try to get around that through the DSEG program and other initiatives, but we haven't made a long-term commitment to upsetting that whole system and making sure every student is in a classroom where they can reach their potential. We have a lot of words that say that in mission statements, but we don't have a lot of policy or action to go with it.
So, conversation around my table, we just get started in like 30 minutes, but we have to begin now to close conversation, having gotten started. What I'd like to do is to ask all three of you to reflect on this question, or I'll even let you choose, because power of choice is great. Question number one to select from: what is the one most impactful action a person can take to ensure that people who have a history of incarceration have opportunity for redemption and self-actualization? I want you to think about the one most impactful action a person can take. The second one that you can opt to speak about, and this will be our close, is what is your call to action for institutions? Not the well-intentioned, but that actually want to get in and do this work. What is the call to action? I'll let you choose which one you want to speak to.
I'm going to go for the latter because I'm deeply concerned with education in this country, and I just feel that, again, we all need to be aware that, colleges and universities in this country operate tax-free, right? They operate on the public dime. They owe something back to society. And some of our most liberal institutions do not enroll formerly incarcerated people. Not only do they not do education in prison, but they have the box on their college education, on their college application. So if you're an alumni of like a university, you're on the board at a university, you should ask them, do we have that question on our application? And why? And why? We need greater educational access in this country in a broad way. And people who've been incarcerated has been greatly disadvantaged educationally, as the film points out. And we should be working as a society to be as inclusive, radically inclusive, around formerly incarcerated people as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go back to the first question about untapped potential. So, if I were a university president, you want to find the most talented students who work the hardest and care the most and take it the most seriously. And on a lot of college campuses, kids are surfing the internet and doing shopping while they're at their lectures, and they're not actually really engaged. And they're just trying to, I have 2 kids who went through college, and I've been to visit them, and I've seen it. So I think, our sense, we have to reimagine our sense of where our most greatest pool of talent lies. And I'm shocked and appalled, frankly, and it's another thing I hadn't thought about that much when I started the project. The elite institutions like my alma mater, Yale, has a $30 billion endowment. They started a prison education program tied to BARD, and they had to, in order to do it, BARD had to give them a grant. In their $30 billion, they did not see fit to spend any of their resources or capital to extend that Yale brand to places where there are some of the most brilliant students. The other day, they published some articles in the Yale Daily News that were written by some of the students in the Yale prison education program. They were really extraordinary, and it just was a tiny little example that every institution, private and public, first of all, they have an obligation as citizens of our society, and second of all, they are ignoring enormous pool of talent that's to all of our detriment.
Well, there's not much to say on top of that, except to maybe challenge the fact that we are in a community rich with higher ed resources. We have a number of universities, public and private. I would hope after next week, when the films, 2 weeks from now, when the films show, there will be a response from our community that says, we know this is the case. We've seen what this can do. We need to put some resource into our local community, the state, the city. Our metropolitan area has the need as much as any other place in the country. I remember hearing the students say this is only reaching about 10% of our population within the prison. That's a big gap to fill. So there's space for all of these institutions. I love the professor talking about we don't get to use all the gimmicks here. So really seeing the basics about what education is for, both for the individual and for what the individual does with the education, I think is a compelling reason for our local institutions to invest in this as part of their call to action for our community.
Oh, thank you. There's nothing I can say behind that. My call to action would be to continue to feel the sense of urgency, but not so feeling it that you do it in isolation on your own, that there's a sense of community and inclusion even in the implementation. There's still advice and humility in the process. So I want to thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to St. Louis. Come back again and see us, please. And to Mary as well for all of your work and leadership in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.